All right. Well, Javier, over to you.
Right. Kay is a very tough act to follow, so I will not pretend even to follow. And after all, he wouldn't want me to. Now, the title was The Book of Time. The full title, when Bill proposed that I do something like this, was actually Krishnamurti's teachings as a reading of the Book of Time. Now, the selections that we saw of the videos basically started with reading the Book of Mankind, reading the Book of Humanity. Krishnamurti used this metaphor at various points. I think beginning probably 1979, 1980, around there, he started doing this. The sense that humanity, there is one text, that human consciousness is one, and it has its own story to tell. It's a long story, and we have to learn to read it. This fits with the whole intent of Krishnamurti's work, which is self-knowledge. What's the human problem? Apparently, we have not been able to understand ourselves, our own internal workings, so that historically we keep running into the same problems over and over again. The sense that history repeats itself is a bit of a standard phrase, but it seems to beg the question as to why it does so. Right? So time, but then Kate takes it much further. He doesn't just accept repetition at any point. The very mechanicalness of the human mind seems to lie behind this fact that something repeats generation after generation, and we are not shifting, as he said this morning, a centimeter or an inch. That's a bit of a short distance to have moved in the last 75,000 years since sapiens is supposed to be around. Now, for me personally, the question of time was an issue that came upon me when I was a little kid. So I'll tell you my problem with time. It's not a theoretical issue altogether, that it is also rooted in the experience of life. I don't know how it happened to you, but this was one of the first instances in which I ran against the issue of time as a fundamental problem in human existence, if it is a problem. So, when I was a little kid, growing up in this rural village in northwestern Spain, I was very curious, like all kids are, to know where I came from and who I was. Now, when I asked my mother where I come from, she told me a very fanciful story that I couldn't figure out. But I had a suspicion that I came from somewhere. Everybody has that suspicion. The sense of being alive indicates the suspicion of an origin. It's like I couldn't have come from nothing. The fact that I have being means that I maybe was. So a simple translation of that is, I would like to know who was before me, out of whom I came. So I was very curious to know the history of my own family. But unfortunately for this curious little boy, his family seemed to have no history. Peasants usually don't have a history. They were just cannon fodder for the kings. So I said to myself, what is there? There must be something. So look, the translation. From being to time. From having this sense of I'm alive. But this I must have some origin, must have some background, must have some source. And the source, of course, you say, well, ancestors, a line of people from whom you come, you descend. You therefore are likely to have their characteristics. So who were they, such that I can say I am this, even as an identity? You seek for an identity. Who are you? So who were before? Now there was no history, and I was really thinking, whoa, without a history, we do not know who we are. It's still going on in the thought of the world, this childish thought, right? So I knew this on the attic of our house, there was a trunk, in which they kept the family memorabilia, so they must be there, right? The Spanish call it el baúl de la memoria, the trunk of memory. So the memory must be there, that's where it's kept, the baúl de la memoria. So I had to whip up my courage a little bit because it was in the attic, and the attic was dark, and in the dark lived the monsters that populated my house. So I had to whip up my courage to get through the door, already remembering from my dreams that they had these very long, bony hands with very long, dark nails and green, horrifying things like the devils that I had seen painted at the church. So there they were. I went upstairs, and there was enough light filtering through the tiles to make it bearable and not suspect that the monsters would come out. So I opened the trunk and I looked. There were some photos, there were some notebooks from my old grandfather who had emigrated to Cuba and so on. And he had been a storyteller, so I expected he had told some story there that would tell me, aha, these are we, these are the people. But there was nothing. There was no story. There were accounting ledgers, how much he earned, how much he spent, and how much he wired home. So I was terrifically disappointed that there was no record of, in the baúl de la memoria, there was no memory. But at that very moment I perceived something, or the thought struck me at least, that actually everything was written already. That I, as a human being, was bound to go through exactly the same experiences as my ancestors. That as a human being, my life was already mapped out. It was a paralyzing thought. Because then what does it mean to live? If your life is already mapped out, if you're going to be angry, aggressive, fearful, fall in love, seek pleasure, possessions, be proud, be hurt, be disappointed, die. What is new then? What does it mean to be alive if time is just this cranking thing of experience? That as human beings, we're all destined from birth to death to fundamentally undergo the same pattern of experience. I've been living with that question ever since. Curiously enough, as far as I'm concerned, when Krishnamurti talks about the book of mankind, he hints at something very similar. I say hint because I haven't understood it fully. He probably is much more assertive, that mankind is trapped in the round of time. Time, which seems to move in one direction, is actually returning. That as far as mankind is concerned, the linear arrow of physical time does not correspond to the psychological time. That psychologically, time is cyclical. Time returns. You and I now here, as human beings, are pretty much the same old human being as far as psychology is concerned. As the whole part of the story of saying technologically we have advanced, psychologically we're standing still. That's a huge question in terms of what does time mean, because then time does not pass. The past is the everlasting present in which we live. Instead, it's all in the past. Now that can't be. We all rebel to being that dead. There must be something to us. There must be something much more profound, some quality of freedom, I don't know, being, which we also had. Those moments of breakthrough wherein we suddenly had this feeling that there was no time, that all being was there, whatever that is, that being has nothing to do with history, with identity, with memory. It cannot be kept in a trunk. This is the dialectic, I think, that underlies our very psychology, underlies the very movement of culture, of civilization. What is time in relation to this timeless ground on which it seems to be spinning around itself? Mankind has this issue. I think it is profound. And Kay takes it to the point of stating something like, in my own words, mind you, saying that only the ending of time can open the door to the awakening and, if you like, the incarnation of truth. That's a huge thing to say. That time and truth don't go together. Now, wait a minute, I am immortal. I like to live in truth, knowing that I'm going to die, so that my death has a meaning. Requiescat in pace, no? Rest in peace. The peace has to come. And there is no peace if time cannot at least run in harmony with the timeless. If life cannot be in harmony with death. So, okay, huge issues, right? Now, what I wanted to do, but Krishnamurti threw a spanner in my works this morning by talking about this book of time, book of mankind in another sense. However, I want to read just one passage from, that's why I have this book in my hand, from Letters to the Schools, where he did a very short, fairly shortest account he gave of this book he was talking about, that he thinks that we have to read. To read it from beginning to end, the book of time that is human consciousness. Consciousness is time, and is there where our life is written. That's what dictates, that's the script. The self, thought, desire, fear, pleasure, pain. The whole thing is written in this book. And this is what we live. Or, this is what we are lived by. And without understanding that, the quality of fullness, of wholeness, of the river of life instead of the river of sorrow cannot emerge. Now that's a serious, if that's true, that's a tremendous challenge to us. One is tragic, one is not. So I'll read you this paragraph just to start on what I hope will be a little description of, at least an attempt at deciphering this book to some degree. So he said, to learn from books is important. So there's other books. But what is far more important is to learn from the book of the story of yourself. Because you are all mankind. To read that book is the art of learning. It is all there. The institutions, their pressures, the religious impositions and doctrines, their cruelties, their faiths. The social structure of all societies is the relationship between human beings with their greed, their ambitions, their violence, their pleasures, their anxieties. It is there, if you know how to look. The book is not out there or hidden in yourself. It is all around you. You are part of that book. The book tells you the story of the human being, and it is to be read in your relationships, in your reactions, in your concepts and values. The book is the very center of your being. And the learning is to read that book with exquisite care. The book tells you the story of the past, how the past shapes your mind, your heart, and your senses. The past shapes the present, modifying itself according to the challenge of the moment. And in this endless movement of time, human beings are caught. This is the conditioning of man. This conditioning has been the endless burden of man, of you and your brother. I like that ending, of your brother, because it makes me already, for my brother, I have a feeling. So when I know that both of us are in this movement of conditioning, we can maybe already feel for each other the compassion that is necessary, because we're trapped together in this prison of time. But as you saw this morning, Krishnamurti was even skeptical as to whether most human beings would even understand the first step, that we, each of us, is the whole of humanity. Right? So that would be a first question, right? Do we even understand that much? Not, and he was always will come back to this distinction between it being a logical conclusion versus the perception of it as a fact. Therefore, the feeling of it in one's life, so that one's perspective is actually changed. That is the test. If one really understands something, then one's perspective is changed. One's feeling for another is changed. That would mean also that the sense of separation between me and you is gone or seriously diminished. That would be the test. So watch out. If there is a real understanding, or there is just a logical conclusion. How we relate, therefore, that will make a lot of difference. Life is relationship. This is the book of life. So, the book is written in our relationships. It's a very beautiful little metaphor that can go a long way to telling us where we have to look if we are beginning to understand who we are is in relationship. And if the past is coming in, then that's conditioning that relationship and in fact destroying it. So that's why then time psychologically becomes an enemy, because it's destroying relationship, which is life itself. It's a tremendous tragic story. If you look at it, if you have a feeling for the tragic mode, he's describing sources of pain, sources of conflict, and he wants to undo those, because that's the way of compassion, that's the way of intelligence. That's what, deep down, is the seed, the intent to goodness that is in the background of all human beings, if we were to pay attention. The intent to goodness, as this, what they used to call the seed of a million years, can that flower? But we have to meet the reality, right? The reality is what? He says, what is this book? What does it contain? It's another talk, and I wouldn't go into that because it is too long. But in Sri Lanka in 1980, second talk, the Book of Life, he went chapter by chapter. And I, being a bit of a bookworm, love the fact that he could go chapter by chapter. So, first he has the introduction. How do we read? That's difficult enough. Obviously, we're not good readers. Mankind is not a good reader, has not been a good reader of itself. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in. There would be freedom. And all those lovely utopian things that we can all come up with to describe the good that we would hope for, but which we don't have. Because we have all these other seeds in our garden. So, what is the first? So he goes to what's the first chapter? So he starts looking, and he says the first chapter shows a wide panorama of division and conflict. Now that's not necessarily the first chapter I want to read. Or I want to go somewhere else already to a field of order and beauty and compassion. But the first existential chapter in our existence is marked by this widespread situation, condition of fragmentation. So this is what we meet. What does the child meet in his family? Meets conflict, meets pain, meets sorrow, meets incomprehension. But he also meets it in himself, meets also anger, meets delusion, all kinds of things. So the boy learns that he's also part of the stream of misunderstanding, of aggression, of fear. The whole thing is running through the whole of mankind. But this is the first chapter. And it's the first, sign of alarm that something is really wrong with us. If this is a kind of, sustained, thoroughgoing state, then something is truly wrong with us. If we are perpetuating a condition of pervasive division and conflict, of pain and sorrow, where is the grand promise of compassion and love? Where is even intelligence, sensitivity, the flowering of goodness that mankind has been on to for at least 3,000 years, since religions were invented? So, there you are, you're puzzled by the fact that somehow there is an impotence in mankind in order to get through this endemic condition. But we have to face it. It is us. It's not my father who's aggressive. It's me who's aggressive. It's everybody in their own way. So blaming my father doesn't help. Poor guy. He was a victim also. And am I also? What does it take, therefore, to be free? Maybe if you're free, you save your own father from his fate. Right? Your ancestors are waiting for their own liberation, as it were, because this part of that stream of consciousness. Think about it. The ancestors are waiting for liberation, and they depend on you who are alive. Maybe you won't succeed. You won't be free. Right? You can think of it as a science fiction movie. The liberators, the ancestors are there in the background because they're in the stream of sorrow, of human consciousness. And you are alive, and only the living can be free. It's an extraordinary thing. Just already a value of life in terms of the liberation of the stream of consciousness itself from its endemic condition of sorrow. I find that extraordinary. That's why I value life. I say, every living being, touch it carefully. Because that's the potential for that very liberation from this ongoing circular movement of sorrow, at the cosmic level. It's a huge thing, right? To even sense it. So conflict, division, pain, suffering as a universal condition. And it has its causes. So he goes into the causes, chapter 2. The causes of conflict. So he looks at various things like authority, he looks socially. The outer look, even if we were to look carefully outwardly, we would start to understand how consciousness lies behind this whole phenomenon. We are, after all, the makers of the society. It's not coming from anywhere else. Even that we lose sight of, right? That it is us, as human beings, who make it. Right? So there you are, authority. One of the causes, social. Now, in Spain, we were very aware of that. We didn't need Krishnamurti to tell us, because we were under a dictatorship. As a cause of disorder, in the name of order. The contradictions of mankind. In the name of order, we create disorder, because we create violence. You cannot sustain order with violence. The church, the dogma. So, authority not just politically, but religiously. There was a famous Spanish author, Camilo José Cela, Nobel Prize for Literature, who was actually from there, from the same region. And he used to say, when you have a dictator in power, then that dictator creates a pyramid of other petty dictators until the very bottom. So it's all dictators all the way down. everybody became a little dictator. It was impossible to hold a rational conversation, even that much, because everything is me. And the me is the supreme dictator in each and every one of us. And that is the structure of society, just emphasize that self-centered, that self-assertiveness of each individual against all the others. It made no difference what opinion it was. Nobody cared very much for the truth. It was the assertion of the self as opposed to another self. Think about it. It goes on in subtler or more complex ways everywhere. So the self already began to emerge as a very serious problem in terms of how we are in the world. And yet it is in that focus where we invest our meaning and significance, our promise of achievement, of realizing our worth. Boy, there's a problem right there. The more you seek for it, the more you entrench yourself in that isolation, maybe. It's a difficulty. So, causes, authority, belief, dogmas, all that kind of stuff. But he comes to a law. Krishnamurti had laws, which was very beautiful, which is, how would you even begin to pin down conflict, disorder? So where there is division, there must be conflict. This is a law. I like laws. I like physics. So it comes with this law. Where there is division, there must be conflict. So that already gives you an alarm. How are we? Therefore, it's not the conflict, but the division that you have to look at. How, because that's the cause. How is division being generated? It's a massive thing, beautiful thing. Right? And that, of course, brings it, he's always doing this thing. From the outer to the inner. This is a manifestation of a cause that consciousness sustains, and we are in that stream of consciousness. So he's bringing it close to home until you can't escape it. We can escape it, say, oh, it's over there. But he brings it more home. So he goes, chapter 3. He says, life is relationship. Now there you are already involved. There is no world. There is just you in relationship with another. There is no society apart from you. You exist in relationship and nowhere else. And relationship is what you do. So it's action and relationship. Completely inseparable. And then you begin to realize what is your responsibility. How do you respond? From where? If you are driven by your own self-centered movement of desire, then you're creating the division that he says is responsible for conflict. You're entering already into the field of fragmentation. And time plays a big part in that. Because my identity is built on time. Thought begins to operate. Thought is me. And thought, as he says, comes from memory. So he starts looking at this movement of relationship. What is it? What are our values? How are we with one another? So he looks at attachment, looks at security, the search for security. Attachment in particular, he looks very much because he's concerned with what is love. We all say love. This is the essence of relationship, right? But very quickly it modulates itself into its opposite. How come that from I love you, we go to this conflict again? It's so systematic how it all breaks down. And how sorrow is perpetuated by this continuous breakdown in relationship, for which we are responsible. So, chapter 4, which is consciousness. But consciousness is its content. And what's the content? Is emotional as well as more abstract. Emotional content is what? We have three basic contents: pleasure, fear, and pain. So he looks at those beautifully. Just three poles, right, of consciousness, emotionally speaking. It's wonderful. I mean, we never really look at that. What are the poles? Consciousness moves around certain poles. You know, if you have the experience, see, I used to think about these things, but one day I discovered something when walking. It's good to walk by yourself, because then you can hear your own mind. And how mechanical the mind is. The conditioning is a mechanism, but we generally don't get to see it somehow. It hides itself in its own projections. It's very odd, the way the mind hides itself from observation. But one evening, for some reason, maybe I was distracted, not paying attention, or something else was paying attention apart from me, because the me won't see itself. And I realized certain things, which were one thing actually. There are 3 poles around which consciousness psychologically spins. At that time, there may be more. So I say it for whatever it's worth. Which is pleasure. Not only sexual, but in all kinds of other ways. He wants pleasure. And that is in part to counter pain. So there are these 2, they go in twos, these poles. Pleasure and pain. There he goes, seeking something there. We are all hooked on that. So pleasure is one of the fundamental poles and contents of consciousness. Second pole, security. Everybody wants security. Look at it, every day you wake up and you have this alarm going on. Where is the danger coming from? It's like a little creature in a little hole trying to protect itself from all the elements and all the predators. It's very elementary, this mind. But so is it. It's based on the biological impulse to survival. And then it has its psychological component. So, security. And security has its own double, which is fear. Fear goes with security. So you have pleasure, pain, security, fear. And then you have, within the social structure, the hierarchical drive, the status. Because that also is connected with security and with pleasure. We have inherited also this drive for hierarchy, for status. And of course that means success. And that was coupled with failure. Just take a look at your own mind, your minds, and see whether that's not operational. Hopefully it's not. Hopefully you're free from it, of course. But it's very elementary. The brain is very elementary. And the biological keeps informing the psychological. This was one of the things I observed. And only then did I begin to understand what actually was the content of such a statement. That the biological is informing the psychological. Good old Attenborough showed me the monkeys. And I saw the monkey. It was me. The monkey was me. In this way, of the way the mind works, is still operating on the biological survival mode of pleasure with its pain, security with its fear, and hierarchy, success with its failure, which the monkeys experience generation after generation, and we still do. And you could map that onto the world and explain, well, I don't know what percentage, but it's a very high percentage of the whole phenomenon of society and what is happening everywhere. So that's important to understand how this is perpetuated. Why are we so hooked? Why is this our conditioning? And what are the consequences? This is also something we don't see. Thought loses sight of itself. It creates its own mode and then loses sight of the consequences. But every thought that goes through our minds has a consequence. This is important also to understand, that thought is not indifferent to what happens to us. We sow the seeds of our own experience. That's amazing. This is a causal system. It's very scary, because then you feel you're free. You're in charge of your life. No, you're not. In this regard, it's just thought creating the seeds of your own experience. What will happen to you in the sphere of relationship depends on how one understands these poles of thinking psychologically. For example, right? Pleasure, security, status. Those determine so much. Just take a look how much the pursuit of pleasure has determined what happened to us in relationship and society, where we ended up, right? For good and not so good. Security, fear, hierarchy, the whole struggle. tremendous stuff. Right? So we have a script. See, this is the script. This is the book of mankind with its chapters, the motivation that is ingrained in the very inherited structure of our evolution as animals, human beings, monkeys. Then it goes further. The content of consciousness is not only emotional, but is driven by the function of thought. So thought suddenly acquires an extraordinary, different meaning from what we normally give. See, in the part of the conversations that we watched, he said, well, I'm saying something entirely contrary to how you're looking at knowledge, at thought. The definition of human beings is a thinking animal. One of the people said, well, it's just a thinking featherless biped. This was the Greek side, they were making a joke. The human beings are a featherless biped, two-footed featherless animal. But okay, it's a thinking animal. So thinking comes to be part of our definition. We didn't know how to distinguish ourselves so clearly from others. Thinking is the distinctive factor. And now we see, or begin to suspect, and this is the diagnosis Kay makes, that thought is part and parcel of the fragmentary process that is inherent to the current operation of consciousness. Now that is a terrifying diagnosis, because we have depended so far on thought, on knowledge, on the known, to pull us out of the condition of pure animality, of the bestiality of pure survival. We have developed technology. We have developed this sphere of culture, so-called. So thought has been an essential instrument in terms of just giving us even a better chance of survival, when not being the very repository of the field of meaning that would give significance to our very existence. It should be encompassed in there. But there come the wise to spoil the party, and they say, no, watch more carefully. Thought is actually responsible for the continuous shortcoming of our understanding of the actual movement of relationship, which is life. And rooted in this animal conditioning, it tends to the tribal fragmentation of society, whereby conflict becomes inevitable. It's a tremendous diagnosis. You look at this book is diagnosing a whole historical process which repeats as long as we don't tackle it, we don't understand it, we don't come upon freedom from it. And that will only happen with understanding, but more than understanding, with insight, right? The flash of light that sees through this whole construction of time. And it goes to this. Thought is behind fear. Thought is behind pleasure. Thought is behind self. Thought is behind the whole structure. So the book of time is written in the language of thought. But it is time. It's all time. And time that takes survey of all the world must have a stop. Why should it have a stop? Because if it doesn't stop, this will go on. We will come back to the same pattern. Thought, being rooted in the past, can't meet this moment now fully. Life bypasses time. It includes it. Where would time be psychologically? My memory, but now. It has no other, may I use the word time? No other time to be. There's only one time to be. Only one time of being is time it can be called, which is the present. The past is in the present. It has no other place to be. But the present goes beyond it, and the past cannot contain it. It is a very beautiful thing. All time is now, he used to say, right? Actually, he used to use the word now to even distinguish it from the present, reducing the word present as that aspect of the now which is already conditioned by the past. Right? The present, to live in the present, which was a big phrase in our 70s when we were young and felt the winds of freedom, live in the now, live in the present, man. Don't worry about the past, the future, let's live. Well, yeah, but you have to have got the awareness of whether the present is not being shaped or is not the continuation, modified, of the past. If it is, then it's not really the now. It's not timeless. It's just the same movement of time being now. So look at it. Countries, nations, religions, you name it, our own identities are the continuation of the past through the present to the future. The now is like a silent space where no memory can enter. It's a very extraordinary thing to consider that in this very moment now, what is now? There's no dimension, but almost no dimension. There all this time is contained. That is also a beautiful indication that there is, I'm not sure if I can use the word always. I have a problem with that word. But that therefore, there is always the possibility of all time coming to an end if you were to meet the now. Right? It is a beautiful suggestion from Kay. Thought can therefore have a stop because there is a border to it. It has a limit. The encounter with that limit, if it is possible, can end it. It's his end. That's the end. What lies beyond it is no longer within his domain. It's a domain. The human consciousness is based on time is a domain. And that domain has a limitation. Even if it is going beyond death, he suggests, this dream, there's such poetry in all this. I don't know, I lose my coordinates. But the suggestion of, as we live, we are in the stream. And unless we step out of it, the stream goes on. So it's like Javier begins at point A and ends at point B. That thing goes out. But the thing that's running through me as consciousness and time, self and all that, the history of mankind goes on. That doesn't die. Interesting. Goes on the other side. It's a picture only, so don't take it for reality. It goes on the other side. I see a circle only. I remember only Plato had a vision like this, right? Goes on underground or whatever, and then it comes up. And the baby cries, and there he is. Not me, but the same consciousness manifesting in another human being. Reincarnation is just the returning. I'm not talking about reincarnation in the way it's understood. Mankind is reincarnating. Consciousness is reincarnating in this way. Reincarnation means comes back to the flesh, comes back to the body, is embodied again and again, generation after generation. Think about it. Mankind has played a trick on the universe. Almost. You could look at it that way. In the search for immortality, it has locked itself in the repeating, returning sphere of time. Unfortunately, time is not immortal. It's the very essence of mortality. We're still in that struggle. The eternal is the timeless. So the ending of time is the essence of that freedom. But is there such an ending? We see the possibility, we see the necessity. But that's, I think, the fundamental task of humanity. Because in our time particularly, and maybe as no other time before, consciousness is showing its limitations in terms of meeting our human issues. As Kay used to put it, in our time, thought has come to the end of its tether. To feel that real limitation in terms of what is necessary for us to be free, whole, and maybe something else. Okay. We talked for a long time. Don't put on the floor.